Coming up next, it's 16 on Cartoon Network.
Coming up next, it's Adventure Time on Cartoon Network.
Coming up next, it's a pup named Scooby-Doo on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's Batman, the Brave and the Bold on Cartoon Network.
Coming up next, it's Baby Looney Tunes on Cartoon Network.
Coming up next, it's Bakugan Battle Brawlers on Cartoon Network.
Coming up next is Ben 10.
Coming up next, it's Ben 10 on Cartoon Network.
Ben 10 Alien Force is coming up next.
Coming up next, it's Ben 10 Alien Force on Cartoon Network. Up next, it's Ben 10 Ultimate Alien on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's Camp Lazlo on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's Chaotic on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's an all-new Chaotic on Cartoon Network.
Chopsaki Chooks is coming up next. Chowder is coming up next.
Coming up next, it's Chowder on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's Codename Kids Next Door, only on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's Codename Kids Next Door on Cartoon Network.
Coming up next, it's Courage the Cowardly Dog on Cartoon Network.
Coming up next, it's Courage the Cowardly Dog on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's Ed, Edd and Eddy on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's Foster's movie, Destination Imagination on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's Foster's movie, House of Blues on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's Foster's Home for Imaginary Friends on Cartoon Network. Up next, it's Garfield on Cartoon Network. Up next, it's Generator Rex on Cartoon Network.
George of the Jungle is coming up next.
Coming up next, it's George of the Jungle on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's Goosebumps on Cartoon Network. Up next, it's Hot Wheels Battle Force 5 on Cartoon Network.
Johnny Test is coming up next.
Coming up next, it's Johnny Test on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's Crypto the Superdog on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's the League of Super Evil on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's Mucha Lucha on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's My Gym Partner's a Monkey on Cartoon Network.
Naruto is coming up next.
Coming up next, it's Pokemon on Cartoon Network. Up next, it's Pokemon Diamond and Pearl. Up next, it's Pokemon Diamond and Pearl Galactic Battles on Cartoon Network.
Pokemon Diamond and Pearl Battle Dimension is coming up.
Coming up next, it's Pokemon on Cartoon Network.
Pokemon Diamond and Pearl Battle Dimension is coming up next.
Coming up next, it's Pokemon Diamond and Pearl Battle Dimension on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's Pokemon Movie 10, The Rise of Darkrai on Cartoon Network.
Pokemon 3. Pokemon 3, the movie, is coming up next. Pokemon 3, the movie, is coming up next.
Cartoon Network. Coming up next. It's Pokemon Diamond and Pearl. Back on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's Pokemon Movie 10, The Rise of Darkrai on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's Regular Show on Cartoon Network.